The costs of tariffs are starting to show up in the U.S. So having a lot of uncertainty about CUSMA is not a great thing. But if it's kind of stayed where we are right now, what we have right now is a situation where a lot of goods do not have high tariffs. We're one of the countries that have the lowest tariffs with the U.S. right now. So overall, it's not a horrible situation.
Canada just pulled off something Donald Trump never expected. It won by doing absolutely nothing. As U.S. tariffs pile up, as American consumers feel the squeeze, and as Washington scrambles to explain why groceries and construction costs keep rising, Canada has quietly become the calmest, most stable player in a chaotic North American economy. And now, heading into the 2026 CUSMA showdown, Ottawa holds more leverage than at any point since the deal was signed. This entire debate began with a surprisingly blunt economic interview. Paul Beaudry, former deputy governor of the Bank of Canada and now a senior advisor at Bennett Johns, laid out a simple message that undercuts Trump's entire tariff narrative. The United States is hurting more than Canada. Beaudry acknowledged that Canadian sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos are feeling pressure, but he emphasized something far more important. The real political pain is showing up in the U.S., not north of the border. American consumers are paying more for basics. U.S. job growth is slowing. Industry groups are growing louder in their frustration. These are not vague macroeconomic trends. They're direct consequences of Trump reviving a tariff machine that looked outdated even the first time around. Meanwhile, Canada enters 2026 with a reputation that every country wants and few can maintain: a stable, predictable, open economy. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Ottawa has leaned into regulatory clarity, investor-friendly policy, and long-term planning. That stability is paying off. Canada delivered a surprise trade surplus this fall, saw its currency strengthen, and attracted a wave of global investment at the exact moment the U.S. is losing credibility over tariff unpredictability. The contrast is unavoidable. One country is escalating the fight, the other is quietly winning it. Let's be honest, tariffs make great political theater, but terrible economics. Reuters reports growing affordability concerns across the United States, and many of those pressures trace directly back to Trump's tariff architecture. When Canada exports less softwood lumber, the price of building a home in the U.S. jumps almost immediately. When Canadian aluminum and steel face higher duties, American manufacturers absorb those costs before a single Canadian producer feels them. This is the part Washington never fully calculated. Canada doesn't need dramatic retaliation. It simply needs to stay steady while U.S. inflation, logistics costs, and industrial pressures build up. Beaudry's assessment was clinical, but devastating. The cost of tariffs is now showing up clearly in the U.S. economy. That observation alone reshapes the entire political dynamic going into the CUSMA review. For months, critics wondered why Ottawa wasn't matching Trump's escalation. Why not impose retaliatory tariffs? Why not mirror Washington's aggression? The answer is, but Canada didn't need to. Ottawa understood that the U.S. relies on Canadian inputs more than Canada relies on American ones. It also understood that tariffs are politically toxic inside the United States. They inflate prices, frustrate manufacturers, and anger Republican governors whose states depend on Canadian supply chains. Most importantly, Canada understood that time itself was an asset. The longer tariffs remained in place, the more voters and businesses in the U.S. would push back. Ottawa didn't choose patience out of weakness. It chose patience because it was the most efficient way to let American domestic politics do the heavy lifting. Something fascinating is happening in global markets. Investors are treating Canada as the safe room of the G7. At a time when Washington's economic direction changes by the week, Canada's policy direction feels steady, measured, and predictable. Reuters notes that global capital is increasingly flowing toward Canada, not away from it. The Canadian dollar has strengthened, borrowing volatility is low, and even with tariffs in place, the country posted a trade surplus that exceeded expectations. This is where the strategic picture shifts. Canada's stability is no longer just a domestic strength. It is becoming a form of leverage against U.S. unpredictability. Investors trust Canada more, supply chains trust Canada more, even American industries are quietly lobbying for more Canadian imports because they prefer certainty to political chaos. In a negotiation as sensitive as CUSMA, predictability becomes power and chaos becomes vulnerability. Beaudry's analysis makes one thing very clear. Canada is entering the CUSMA renegotiation with leverage it simply didn't possess in 2018. U.S. tariffs have generated real economic pain at home, and Washington cannot afford for that pressure to intensify during a presidential election cycle. Manufacturers in the Midwest, home builders across the Sunbelt, and tech companies building energy-hungry AI infrastructure are all pushing for cost relief. Canada, on the other hand, remains one of the lowest tariff partners under Trump's revised policy landscape. Even in a volatile global environment, Canada enjoys better access to U.S. markets than many U.S. allies. At the same time, the energy demands of America's AI boom are tying the U.S. even more tightly to Canada's clean and abundant power supply. Every new data center built in the U.S. makes Canada more valuable, not less. And beyond the continent, the world is quietly voting with its money. Australian pension giants, European corporations, and Asian cleantech players are expanding their Canadian footprint while scaling back exposure to U.S. unpredictability. These global flows strengthen Canada's bargaining position in ways that weren't imaginable even 2 years ago. Trump enters CUSMA 2026 needing a clean win. Canada enters ensuring that any deal must reflect economic reality.
Here's the irony that will define 2026. The more Trump escalates, the more leverage Canada gains. The U.S. cannot enter the next phase of CUSMA with angry manufacturers, expensive building materials, and a tech sector desperate for reliable energy inputs. Canada, meanwhile, enters the negotiations with investor confidence, trade stability, and strategic relevance that grows with every passing month. Trump has the louder megaphone, Canada has the stronger position, and in trade negotiations, position always beats volume.
Trump's tariff war was designed to pressure Canada, yet it ended up pressuring the United States. Canada didn't need dramatic countermeasures or aggressive retaliation. It simply needed to remain steady and allow economic gravity to bend back toward Washington. As we move toward the 2026 CUSMA review, the central question is no longer whether Canada can withstand U.S. pressure. The real question is how far Ottawa will choose to push its advantage, now that the United States is the side showing the most visible strain. For the first time in a long time, Canada isn't reacting to North American trade politics. Canada is shaping them.
A day after admitting he made a mistake dismissing questions about Donald Trump, the Prime Minister offering new aid to industries he may have offended.
We must protect our workers and our industries who are most exposed to U.S. tariffs.
Mark Carney further limiting the amount of foreign steel coming into Canada at a lower tariff rate.
We will absolutely make sure that there are steel and aluminum and sometimes, depending, lumber requirements, because we need to protect jobs in these tariff sectors.
Canada just drew a hard steel line across North America. In a single sweeping announcement, Ottawa unveiled powerful new steel protection measures that rewrite who gets to supply steel in this country and who no longer will. And if Donald Trump believed Canada would quietly endure his tariffs, this week proved the opposite. Canada is fortifying its steel market, defending its steel workers, and reclaiming control of an industry the U.S. tried to destabilize. Prime Minister Mark Carney has launched a major realignment of Canada's steel economy, responding directly to the intensifying wave of U.S. tariffs that have hit Canadian mills since early 2025. According to real-time reporting from Reuters, CBC, AP, and Global News, the federal government is moving to curb foreign steel, prioritize Canadian steel in construction, and boost steel producers through new financing tools, freight subsidies, and tighter enforcement against steel dumping. Under the new framework, Canada will drastically reduce tariff-free steel imports from non-FTA countries compared to 2024 volumes, cut back privileged access for other suppliers, end temporary tariff remissions by the start of 2026, and impose a global 25% tariff on targeted steel-derived goods, such as wind towers, prefabricated structures, wire products, and fasteners, a market valued at roughly $10 billion. The government will also implement a nationwide Buy Canadian requirement for any federal contract over $25 million, ensuring major infrastructure projects use domestic steel. Freight rates for interprovincial steel shipments will be cut in half, supported by direct funding to major rail carriers. And a strengthened compliance force inside the Canada Border Services Agency will focus specifically on preventing steel dumping and false origin declarations. This bundle is not a symbolic tweak, it is a structural reshaping of Canada's steel economy, a steel shield built at a moment when steel workers need the support the most. For years, Canada has lived under the shadow of U.S. trade attacks, especially in steel. Each time Washington revived Section 232 national security tariffs or tightened its Buy American rules, Ottawa found itself racing to limit the fallout. But with Trump's return to the White House and his renewed focus on punitive steel tariffs, Canada is no longer content to react. Carney's measures show a country drawing strength from its own steel capacity and refusing to let its industrial foundation erode under U.S. pressure. By building demand at home and protecting steel from volatile import surges, Canada is saying clearly that steel is not just another commodity. Steel is strategic, steel is sovereignty, and steel is worth fighting for. Trump's expanding steel tariffs were intended to repatriate production and weaken foreign competitors. Instead, the tariffs hollowed out integrated supply chains, collided with refinery and manufacturing realities, and pushed Canada to build its own steel protections. This is the political irony of the moment. Trump struck the first blow in steel, but Canada is the one using it to strengthen its long-term industrial independence. Canadian mills in Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, and Regina have faced years of uncertainty from unpredictable U.S. policy. These new measures replace uncertainty with structural support. If Washington won't offer stability, Canada will create it. Behind this policy is a very real economic urgency. Steel companies across the country have been forced into layoffs in 2025 due to tariff distortions and the collapse of long-standing export channels. Industry leaders warned Ottawa that without decisive action, a sector employing tens of thousands of Canadians could suffer irreversible damage. Carney's steel push is more than politics. It is a recognition that steel workers cannot build careers, plan their futures, or invest in their communities if their industry is constantly exposed to foreign manipulation. Steel needs a predictable home base, and Ottawa is finally providing it. The most transformative element of this entire package is the new Buy Canadian requirement for federal projects. It doesn't just adjust procurement rules, it rewires the entire industrial map of the country. From now on, every major federally funded bridge, port expansion, transit corridor, and national housing build will be anchored by Canadian steel. This instantly turns the federal government into the single largest and most reliable customer for domestic mills, giving the sector stable, long-term demand that no private market cycle can replicate. It mirrors the logic behind Washington's Buy American laws, but it finally gives Canada a strategic steel doctrine of its own. With these measures in place, Canada now stands to retain an estimated $1.5 to $2 billion of steel demand that previously leaked out through import dependence. The 50% freight rate reduction keeps tens of millions more inside Canadian mills instead of being burned away in transportation costs. And the shift in procurement direction means U.S. steel producers, who once held a deep and automatic position in Canada's market, are now poised to lose roughly $400 to $600 million of annual access. In other words, the steel advantage that Washington enjoyed for decades is slipping, and Canada is reclaiming its share by redirecting major national projects back toward its own workers and its own industrial base. This is more than procurement policy. It is a declaration that Canada intends to control the future of its steel economy, and that the era of relying on unpredictable U.S. supply chains is over.
Internationally, the timing is no coincidence. At APEC 2025 and during bilateral talks with major Asian and European partners, Carney emphasized the importance of diversifying Canada's trade landscape and reducing vulnerability to U.S. disruptions. By taking decisive control of the steel file, Canada is showing global investors it will not allow its strategic sectors to be weaponized by foreign politics. This also improves Canada's negotiating position. Countries respect partners that protect their own industries. Canada's steel measures send a clear message. This country is serious about industrial sovereignty, and it will defend its steel sector with the same conviction Washington uses to defend its own. American officials have not re-engaged in steel tariff talks despite repeated signals from Ottawa. The Trump administration remains fixated on reshoring production to U.S. facilities, leaving little incentive to negotiate with Canada. That silence has forced Ottawa to stop waiting for relief and start building its own steel reality. If Washington will not open the door, Canada will weld its own frame. The steel measures introduced this week are the foundation of that new structure.
Canada's new steel protections mark a defining moment in the country's industrial reinvention. For the first time in years, Ottawa is not trying to preserve an old North American balance. It is forging a Canadian one, built on Canadian steel, Canadian workers, and Canadian control. Canada is proving that steel strength is not measured in rhetoric. It is measured in policy, resilience, and the willingness to defend your economic core. Trump's tariffs triggered this confrontation. Canada's steel strategy is how Ottawa wins it. And now the question is unavoidable. If Canada is ready to defend steel this aggressively, what other sectors will receive the same steel-strong approach?
We will need to do more. We will do it deliberately. We will do it in a way that gets effective value for money.
The Canadian government is also spending $253 million to upgrade power plants, accelerate housing, and to help complete the first phase of a hydroelectricity facility in Nunavut.
So far, we know 5 of the new ones. 3 are critical mineral mines. The other 2 projects are Indigenous-led. A hydro project in Iqaluit intended to reduce the city's reliance on diesel fuel, and the Silissum liquefied natural gas project in British Columbia.
Canada is quietly reshaping the Arctic, and this time it's not about soldiers or sovereignty speeches. It's about power, real power. Prime Minister Mark Carney's latest budget earmarks federal funding to launch the Iqaluit Hydro Project, a clean energy breakthrough in Nunavut that could finally replace the North's diesel dependence with 100% renewable electricity. It may look like a local energy story, but make no mistake, this is a geopolitical play. Because while Donald Trump obsesses over tariffs and walls, Canada is literally wiring the Arctic for the next century. Sources confirmed this month that Ottawa has added at least 6 new nation-building projects to its major infrastructure list, 3 critical minerals mines, 2 Indigenous-led ventures, and 1 signature clean energy development, the Iqaluit Hydro Project. Under Carney's budget, Ottawa is committing 20 million CAD for the development phase to move the project into shovel-ready status, with another 94 million spread across northern power upgrades. The ultimate build-out, projected at roughly 350 million CAD, would replace the capital of Nunavut's diesel-burning grid entirely with hydroelectric power generated by Nunavut Nukitsitsiut Corporation, Canada's first wholly Inuit-owned clean energy developer. That matters. Iqaluit, perched on the edge of the Arctic Circle, currently flies in millions of liters of diesel every year. Replacing that with hydropower isn't just good climate policy, it's a statement that the North is open for business, innovation, and sovereignty. Carney's timing isn't accidental. It comes as Canada pushes to diversify away from the United States' volatile trade policies and to invest billions in critical minerals, renewables, and infrastructure that tie remote regions directly to the national economy. Ottawa calls these projects nation-building. Washington calls them protectionist. Either way, they mark a decisive turn in how Canada defines power.
The project's purpose goes far beyond clean electricity. It anchors Canada's Arctic security and sovereignty strategy, a multi-year initiative unveiled in 2025 alongside new radar and port investments. For decades, Canada's Arctic towns depended on imported diesel, economically inefficient and environmentally disastrous. By funding hydro at Iqaluit, Ottawa's proving that sustainable energy can also be a tool of sovereignty. Every megawatt produced in Nunavut strengthens Canada's claim that its Arctic is not an empty frontier, but a functioning self-sufficient region. That matters geopolitically. The Northwest Passage, Arctic shipping routes, and mineral deposits are increasingly contested by global powers, including Russia and China. Hydropower infrastructure plants Canada's flag in a new way, through presence, investment, and permanence. It's also a showcase for reconciliation. Nunavut Nukitsitsiut Corporation is Indigenous-owned, meaning local communities will hold long-term equity in their own energy future.
In Carney's words, this is sovereignty built from the ground up.
Canada's Arctic is sitting atop an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of undiscovered gas, and immense critical mineral reserves. Yet until now, it lacked the infrastructure to unlock that potential sustainably. Hydroelectric power changes the equation. With clean, stable energy, mining operations can scale responsibly, and communities can attract investment without relying on fossil fuel logistics. It's easy to underestimate how transformative that is. For decades, northern projects stalled because they needed constant diesel shipments, expensive, risky, and vulnerable to U.S. supply chains. Once Iqaluit's hydro goes live, it sets a precedent for other Arctic hubs, Cambridge Bay, Rankin Inlet, and Resolute, to follow. This is what economists called strategic capacity building, and politically, it's a shot across the bow of Trump's America First agenda. Canada isn't just weathering Trump's tariffs, it's rewriting the regional map so that the North, not Washington, controls Arctic growth.
At first glance, Donald Trump probably sees no reason to care about a small hydro dam in Nunavut. But here's why he should, and why he eventually will. First, it undermines America's Arctic monopoly. The U.S. has long viewed Alaska as its northern anchor, assuming Canada would remain a junior partner. Yet Canada's renewed Arctic infrastructure means Washington will now have to treat Ottawa as an equal stakeholder in northern security and resource governance. Second, the clean energy shift exposes a gap in U.S. policy. While Trump cancels offshore wind permits, attacks environmental rules, and courts coal voters, Canada is electrifying the most remote region of the continent. That contrast will not go unnoticed by investors. Already, European funds looking to divest from fossil fuels are eyeing Canada's northern projects as politically stable, ESG-compliant alternatives. Third, Iqaluit Hydro reinforces Canada's critical minerals independence. The more energy security Canada gains in the Arctic, the faster it can scale mineral extraction for lithium, nickel, and copper, resources the U.S. desperately needs for its own EV and defense industries. If Washington imposes tariffs or supply chain barriers, Ottawa now has leverage, control of northern inputs. Put simply, Trump's protectionism pushed Canada to do exactly what he feared most: stand on its own. Iqaluit Hydro is symbolic of that new independence. It's small on a map, but enormous in meaning.
Trump's 2025 budget slashed funding for Arctic research and reversed many renewable energy incentives. His administration prioritizes oil leases in Alaska but neglects infrastructure resilience. Canada, under Carney, is moving in the opposite direction, viewing the Arctic not as a frozen outpost but as a national growth engine. That contrast is political gold for Ottawa. It lets Carney frame his investments as pragmatic nation-building rather than partisan climate activism. When critics accuse him of overspending, he can point to Iqaluit and say, "This is sovereignty, this is security." Trump's rhetoric of dominance may still resonate in the U.S., but his economic model, tariffs, deregulation, short-term extraction, feels outdated in a region defined by long-term adaptation. The Arctic rewards patience and partnerships, not bluster. So while Trump warns about foreign encroachment in the Arctic, Canada is actually doing something about it, building ports, power grids, and partnerships that ensure no outside power, not even Washington, can dictate the North's future. The Iqaluit Hydro project is more than a renewable energy facility. It's the foundation of a northern strategy that merges environment, economy, and sovereignty into one coherent vision. It's Canada proving that national security in the 21st century isn't about missiles, it's about megawatts. Carney's investment sends a message. The Arctic belongs to those who build in it. Each turbine, each transmission line is an assertion of independence. And as the world's great powers jostle for influence in the polar north, Canada's calm, pragmatic approach is setting the new standard. The irony? Trump's obsession with tariffs may have inadvertently triggered Canada's greatest era of self-reliance since Confederation. As America fights trade wars, Canada is building power plants.
The next time Washington lectures Ottawa about doing its part, Carney can point north and say, "We already are." If clean energy becomes the new measure of sovereignty, who really owns the Arctic future? The country building hydro dams or the ones still fighting over tariffs?
The diplomatic relationship between Canada and China appears to be on the mend after years of strain and a more recent escalation in trade tensions, with both Ottawa and Beijing agreeing to reopen communication lines, potentially paving the way for a summit between Mark Carney and Xi Jinping.
Across the headlines this week, one story stands out. Canada and China are rebuilding ties after years of silence. Foreign Minister Anita Annan's visit to Beijing has reopened diplomatic channels, and both sides are now preparing for a possible summit between Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Xi Jinping. For many in Washington, this news came as a shock. Only a year ago, relations between Ottawa and Beijing were frozen, strained by disputes over canola, seafood, and the detention of Canadian citizens. Yet now, the same two nations are moving toward dialogue, trade, and cooperation. What changed? The answer lies not in Beijing, but in Washington. President Donald Trump's trade policies were meant to protect American industry and bring Canada closer under U.S. control. Instead, his tariff war has fractured North America's supply chains and pushed Canada to look elsewhere. Trump's 25% import tax on medium and heavy trucks takes effect in November, adding to a long list of duties on steel, aluminum, autos, and furniture. The goal was to pressure Canada to return manufacturing jobs to U.S. soil. The result has been the opposite. Rather than yielding to Trump, Ottawa is quietly reshaping its global position, one trade deal, one conversation, and one handshake at a time. In Ottawa, the mood is cautious but determined. After months of failed negotiations with Washington, the Carney government has begun to de-escalate. A new 100-page order published this month removes dozens of counter-tariffs on both the U.S. and China. The policy shift is sweeping. Many categories of Chinese steel and aluminum, previously restricted, can now enter Canada duty-free. Tariffs on American steel, health equipment, and even construction materials have been reduced. One Ottawa housing project, for instance, received an exemption to import steel doors tax-free. The reaction at home has been mixed. Canada's steel industry warned that cheaper Chinese imports could flood the market. Ontario Premier Doug Ford urged a tougher line, saying the country must not bend under Trump's pressure. But Mark Carney took a different approach. There are times to hit back and times to talk, he told reporters. Now is the time to talk. Behind that calm tone lies a deeper calculation. Canada's auto sector has been hit hard since Stellantis announced it would move Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois. 3,000 Canadian jobs lost, 5,000 gained in the U.S. The same tariffs designed to boost American manufacturing have crippled Ontario's supply chain. By easing counter-tariffs, Carney is trying to stabilize costs for domestic producers and keep inflation from rising. More importantly, he's signaling to Washington that Canada still has options, and one of them is Beijing. As China hints at lifting restrictions on canola and seafood, both sides are preparing to discuss EV tariffs. If these talks succeed, it would mark the first real thaw between the two countries since 2018. For Carney, it is not about choosing China over the U.S. It is about restoring leverage in a world where Trump controls the economic board.
Trump's tariffs were supposed to isolate China and reinforce U.S. dominance in North American trade. Instead, they have created an opening that China is quick to exploit. Beijing's economy has slowed, and exports need new markets. Canada, a G7 democracy with strained U.S. ties, fits perfectly. By reopening trade with Ottawa, China gains both an economic partner and a diplomatic bridge into the Western world. For the United States, this shift carries real consequences. Canadian importers now find Chinese metals and components cheaper than U.S. products weighed down by tariffs. Canadian farmers, previously locked out of Chinese markets, may regain access for canola and pork. In short, China is regaining ground through the very system Washington tried to weaponize. Meanwhile, the U.S. industrial heartland, the Midwest, is feeling the cost. Higher steel and transport prices are eating into profits. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, American construction firms have seen material costs rise by nearly 12% since early 2024. For them, Trump's trade war is not protection, it is punishment. And yet, the ripple effects stretch far beyond economics. Global investors are quietly adjusting their forecasts, shifting billions of dollars from U.S. assets into Canada's resource and manufacturing sectors. Ottawa's reputation as a stable gateway to both Western and Asian markets is gaining traction, while America's unpredictability under Trump is driving partners to hedge their bets. Even European automakers are now eyeing joint ventures in Canada to bypass U.S. tariffs and access cheaper Chinese materials. What began as a tariff wall has become a bridge, one connecting Beijing to North America through Canadian soil. And as Ottawa reopens its doors to Chinese trade, American exporters risk losing a loyal customer. Canada remains the United States' largest export market. If even a fraction of that commerce shifts toward Asia, U.S. manufacturers could lose billions in annual revenue. The irony is sharp. Trump promised to bring jobs home and weaken Beijing's reach. But his approach has pushed Canada, America's closest ally, to cooperate with China instead. The more Washington tightens, the more Ottawa looks for air.
For decades, Washington stood at the center of North America's economy. Every major supply chain, from autos to agriculture, ran through the United States. But that order is now shifting. Canada is quietly building a more independent path, one that connects west to east rather than north to south. The upcoming Carney-Xi meeting, if confirmed, will symbolize that evolution. For China, the summit would mark a small diplomatic victory. For Canada, it would prove that middle powers can still navigate between giants. In this new landscape, Trump's tariffs look less like strength and more like self-inflicted isolation. His America First policy has left allies searching for alternatives. Canada's outreach to China is not a betrayal. It is a reflection of a global economy that refuses to stand still. The message is clear. When trade becomes a weapon, nations find new allies. Canada's decision to reopen with China may reshape the balance of power in North America, forcing Washington to confront the limits of its own strategy. Trump's tariffs were meant to rebuild American control. Instead, they have rebuilt Canada's independence. And as the world watches Ottawa's next move, one thing is certain. The ripple effects of this policy reversal will extend far beyond Beijing, far beyond Washington, and deep into the future of the North American economy.